Alright then, so to kick off this video series, I'm going to break down the first couple of videos, hopefully the first video on one type of blood vessel. So we're going to get started by talking about arteries, and that will cover the first video, and then as we progress on we'll just focus more and more on veins and then capillaries, and then we'll do lymphatics, right? So to start off, this video is just about arteries. When we're thinking about arteries, okay, we need to be thinking about the structure of these blood vessels, the function, where they are within the body as well, which often gives rise to their function, and also hemodynamics, which is the force of circulating the blood from the heart, right? So the original pressure from the heart is going to force the blood around the circulatory system, and then the exchange of that blood as well is called hemodynamics. Right, so as a broad kind of view on the vessels, we know we have arteries, veins and capillaries, but those things often branch out into smaller blood vessels, what we call arterioles and venules. So arteries are big, large vessels that withstand very high pressures. They then progress out further, so the further away they get from the heart, they turn into arterioles, and these are basically where the arteries meet the capillaries. The capillaries are where gaseous exchange takes place between the tissue in question. The very first point of a vein from an actual tissue is a venule. So it goes the opposite way. We almost start off with a large vessel of the artery that gets smaller into a venule, and even smaller still into a capillary. As it gets wider, you then go into a venule, and then you go into a vein. So it's the flip side of the artery. And then those veins are obviously going to transport that blood back to the heart as well for reoxygenation. Okay, we also have a vasa vasorum, which are the blood vessels that supply the cells inside the blood vessels. Now, arteries are very, very pressurized vessels. They consist of three layers. We have a tunica interna, media, and externa. So the interna is basically endothelial. The tunica media is more skeletal muscle, smooth muscle, and that muscle there is to contract and really push the blood through the artery. Now, you also have an elastic lamina. So this, you notice this word elastic over here. This is super important for recoil. As arteries get wider when the blood is flowing through them, they need to then recoil back to their original shape. The tunica media, like we said, is the skeletal muscle, and then the externa we have elastic and collagen fibers. So we know arteries carry blood away from the tissues. That's why they have that. They begin with A, right? So A for away, arteries, right? And the functional properties are, we need to get these down solidly. So elasticity, the ability to recoil after contraction, after expansion of that, contraction of the heart, but expansion of the artery. Now that allows the arteries to maintain this high pressure. Like I said, it's no good as the heart contracts and then you have this stretching of the artery because of that pressure. It's no good it remaining that stage, because then with the next heartbeat, the pressure will drop a little bit. And as it gets further and further out, you'll need greater and greater pressures of the heart to maintain pressure. So arteries have adapted and evolved to recoil, yeah, to go back to their original shape. Now this is often, elasticity is often a sign of longevity as well. So as we age, our elasticity in our arteries may actually falter a little bit, much like our skin is elastic. Okay, if you pinch the back of your hand, for example, on your knuckle, if you pinch there, you'll notice that it stays upright for a little bit and then recoils. The older you are, your skin recoils less, because of the protein elastin is wearing away, basically. So a very similar idea there. As we age, this process does not become as efficient. The contractility then is because of the smooth muscle in the tunica media. So that is because there is active contraction, and that is that's going to be parasympathetic, but it's also going to be unconscious, right? So it's part of the autonomic nervous system. You cannot think to control. You're using your ego, for example. You can't think to control your arteries or contract your arteries. It's unconscious, autonomic. Okay, as opposed to conscious. And then that is really where we have the lumen size decreasing as well. So when we look at the elastic arteries, we said that the pressure is pushing out with every successful ventricle contraction. That pressure is going to be maintained, and then we have this recoil here, and that's the elastin. But the lumen itself this is really where we see quite a lot of activity, I guess, and some high importance. The lumen of an artery needs to be fairly narrow. Now, it may not look that narrow, but compared to a vein, it is. And that's because you have this high, you can actually see the striated muscle in here, and this is muscle cells. Okay, I can see that because I know that because I cannot see where one cell starts and one cell ends, for example. You know, it's kind of blurred, isn't it, in the sarcolemma? Now, the factors affecting elasticity, like I mentioned, is aging, and that aging is actually associated with atherosclerosis as well, which is a plaque build-up, and this is basically scar tissue. This is a fibrous tissue, so this word sclerosis here just means kind of hardening and scarring as well, and that can be caused because of inflammation. There can be genetic influences as well, you know, depending on the lifestyle factors and diet. Okay, so if there's a very high, we won't go into this too much, but if there's a skewed ratio of HDL to LDL, the type of transport protein that carries cholesterol, for example, we have HDL and LDL. Low density lipoprotein, generally considered bad. High density lipoprotein, generally considered better for you. If you have more low density lipoprotein, you have an increased risk of developing atherosclerosis, as one example, and as well with genetic conditions as well. Exercise helps this as well, stops the build up of blood as well. Okay, so because then you have this scarring, so this is a plaque. This is what we call a plaque, and this is, notice the length, the kind of the sheer mass of this plaque compared to in a healthy individual is huge, right? Which then restricts the lumen, which then puts more pressure on the heart and more pressure on the arteries, and then because of that you're at more risk of having a hemorrhage where the blood actually bursts through, or you're at more risk of having stroke or myocardial infarction, which is a heart attack, and that's because there is more pressure, there's more collisions between platelets, and there's more chance for thrombus forming. So if there's a thrombus forming on the walls over here, it's going to occlude or sort of restrict the blood flow, right? Whereas if there's a thrombus up here, loads of blood can still get through. So that's why the risk is there, you know. So then an arteriole is effectively an anastomosis off of an artery. So you have a massive artery over here, and this may be, you can say from the heart, let's say the heart's down here, the aorta's up here, and then this is maybe the first, this can be an artery, this can be the radial artery or something, coming down your arm. Okay, as that radial artery passes down the middle of your arm, you have these branches. Okay, and these branches are going to form into an arteriole, and they are smaller arteries. They are smaller arteries, they still have the same, or rather similar physical characteristics. So if you were to look at like a cross-section of them, they would still appear very similar, but they are smaller, lower pressures, and their purpose, I guess, is to control blood flow to tissues. And that's why you'll notice there are smooth muscle fibers around here, and these smooth muscle fibers are effectively sphincters. So these smooth muscles, you can see one nicely there, they would contract then to restrict blood flow to a certain site. Right, so this is what we were saying. If there is, let's say, a blockage, let's say this one's closed off, this is the main path to this tissue, there is now a blockage, you know, there is a, for whatever reason, there's a thrombus or an embolism over here restricting the blood flow. This sphincter can then open and allow the blood to still get to the tissue, but through a different route. We did mention that a bit last week, but I digress. And then we have the capillaries over here, where we have this mixing, or rather the exchange of oxygen and CO2. So we go from red to sort of like this purpley blue colour, so oxygenated to deoxygenated blood. Okay, we'll look at capillaries on their own a bit. Okay, but this is really what I was talking about, this smooth muscle cell that's wrapped around. This is effectively a sphincter, and like I said, that sphincter is going to control blood flow as well, the direction of blood flow. Okay, so that's where we're going to leave it, just there. So that's arteries and arterioles. We'll cover very much the same sort of methodology in the vein as well, and I think what we'll do is we'll just start talking about capillaries, because there's not a whole lot to talk about with capillaries, but we'll introduce that to venules and veins in the next video. Thank you.